A very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today from the Global Development Network and from our close partner, the Center for Innovation Policy and Governance, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. And my name is Francesco Bino. I'm head of programs at the Global Development Network, and I'll be chairing today's webinar titled Doing Research in Indonesia, Bridging the Research Gap and Improving Development Policies. This webinar launches a report titled Doing Research in Indonesia, a piece of research funded by GDN's Doing Research program, and more, we'll say a few more words on this program soon, and implemented by the Center for Innovation Policy and Governance. This webinar will last 90 minutes and is structured as follows. After a brief introduction, we will have a presentation of 20 minutes by the research team who carried out the study, and 2 rounds of comments from invited speakers, who I'll be introducing later. We will then be discussing the presentation with everyone who joined us. Feel free to use the Q&A section, the Q&A box, to ask questions or like questions asked by others throughout the webinar, starting immediately, in fact. And keep an eye out for the polls that will be launching after the presentations and the comments. For any questions or technical problems, you can reach us by messaging the panelists in the chat box, message all panelists, or send an email to doingresearch@gdn.int. And I would now like to invite Pierre Jacquet. Hello, Pierre.
Hello.
GDN's president. We can hear you, Pierre. Excellent. For a few opening remarks. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. It is really a great pleasure to be with you virtually and to open this webinar. Let me also extend a very warm welcome indeed to all those who have joined us today and to all our partners and friends who participate in this Doing Research program. I would like first to say a few words about GDN. GDN, for those of you who don't know us, is an international organization headquartered in New Delhi. Our mission is to empower developing country social science researchers by doing several things, providing them opportunities to conduct high quality research in their country and to partner with their peers across countries and across disciplines, by connecting them with senior researchers who can interact with them during the research process, by providing them with opportunities to make their own research known and to disseminate their work, and by creating opportunities for them to take part in policy debates nationally and internationally. And this mission is based on 4 major premises. One is that social science research as an investigation into major societal issues and development challenges provides insights that are crucial for the quality of development policies. The second one is that social science research is a facilitator of informed dialogue, confronting ideas based on facts, existing knowledge, and the use of reason. Third, we think at GDN that national social science capacity is essential to support such dialogue and to intermediate insights from global research into the national context. And 4, we also think that the role of social science, contrary maybe to what seems to have become conventional wisdom, is not essentially about providing solutions. The development process doesn't consist in applying research-made solutions, even if the latter are elaborated in the most famous universities. It is better based on the interaction between policy decisions and actions and a constant process of scientific inquiry into pressing development challenges. It is this inquiry process that we want to encourage and empower, and we strongly believe that it should be based and organized locally. This has naturally led GDN to focus on how this scientific inquiry process is organized within countries, and this is the foundation of the Doing Research program, of which the study that will be presented on Indonesia during this webinar is part. Doing Research is a global program in which we partner with development research donors and national research institutions in developing countries to generate evidence on research systems and their evolution. It is a comparative, multi-country effort built around a common analytical framework and coordinated by GDN. The framework was itself established thanks to a pilot program that took place a couple of years ago. The main research vehicle is called the Doing Research Assessment, or DRA, and it is Indonesia's DRA that will be discussed today. Francesco will describe the program in more detail, but let me end these remarks by a few comments on the raison d'etre of this Doing Research program. The starting point, as I already hinted, is that the connection between research and action is not a linear process that transforms scientifically based recommendation into policy prescriptions. It is a messy, even chaotic, multi-pronged and localized process that is intermediated by many actors and many diverse institutions, covering the whole research value chain from production to dissemination to consideration and use. Any commitment to make research more useful for policy and to connect them better requires an in-depth understanding of that process and of its components. By understanding the process better and by doing it in a comparative way across countries, we hope we can generate debate and ideas on how to make it work better. DRAs, doing research assessments, are expected to bring light on strengths and weaknesses, on potential obstacles to doing and using research that, once brought to the limelight, can be discussed and mitigated. We thus hope that DRAs will provide a localized evidence base that can inform national and international strategies on research policies and funding, allowing to tailor the latter better to the needs of researchers in specified countries and to the working of the research and research to policy processes within these countries. And we hope that these DRAs will provide a nudge to national governments to focus more on the effectiveness of the domestic social science research systems. So doing research has been one of GDN's flagships. It is an initiative based on a partnership between developing country institutions and like-minded development institutions and development donors to better understand the making of research and its use in informing development policies. With this, let me hand over to Francesco and wish you a very productive debate on this Indonesian study. Thank you. Thank
you very much, Pierre. Let me add a few points to what you said for those who are discovering today the Doing Research program. Well, the Doing Research assessment, as you mentioned, is the analytical core of the program and focuses on the national research system at the national level, because we think that the range of opportunities and challenges social sciences face, whether in terms of quality, equity, or access to resources, or influence even on decision makers, despite the critical importance of regional and global connections, are defined by what happens within national boundaries. We define a research system as the interplay of three functions: production on one side, but also diffusion and uptake on the other. And one aspect that is interesting in the Indonesian context, which we might get a chance to discuss a little bit later, is the question of who feels part of the system and where do they locate themselves in this larger whole. Finally, we see the Doing Research assessment, so this an analytical exercise of this landscape mapping of the research system, what we present today in Indonesia, as a starting point for building research agendas and stimulating discussions on research policy that can only be led by local research institutions. Hence our choice to have local PIs and to connect them across countries in a network of scholars that study research systems. Perhaps one more thing I should mention is that GDN has been playing the role of a global coordinator between national and international actors interested in this topic. And we aspire to remain a coordinator and a facilitator, a convener that keeps the feedback loop open between the national teams and the development of a common methodology, but also the feedback loop between the network of Southern scholars that we're building and global donors interested in this agenda. This means obviously that if you want to play a role in this initiative, you should contact us and we'll be more than happy to discuss. We've currently implemented the program in 12 countries. The latest entry is Venezuela with IDRC, and hello to DC colleagues who connected today. But we have implemented the full doing research assessment, the exercise we presented today on Indonesia, in 4 countries along the last 20 months after this specific methodology was developed. Beyond Indonesia, we worked in Bolivia, Myanmar, and Nigeria. This is what we call the proof of concept of this program. As we move forward, we're not only eager to present the single country study we completed, but to start looking at what issues recur across countries and how similarly or differently they present themselves in different contexts, and what this means for the research system strengthening agenda nationally and internationally, and obviously also for donors at the national and at the local level. So if what you'll hear today, like strikes a chord with you as a donor, as a policymaker, or as a researcher, please get in touch. Without further ado, I'd like now to leave the floor to our colleagues who led the study in Indonesia for the presentation of findings. Our first speakers today are Inaya Rahmani, who's the PI of the study, who's an assistant professor of the Faculty of Social and Political Science at the Universitas Indonesia, and Zulfa Zakia, assistant professor at the Faculty of Languages and Arts, Universitas Negeri Semarang. I apologize for the pronunciation. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, Inaya.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Pierre, and thank you for everyone for being here today with us. Zulfa, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Should we begin the presentation?
Yes,
while Zulfa prepares the slide for both of us, I'd like to give a short recap about our cooperation with the Global Development Network. The first time that we carried out a doing research project for GDN was in 2014. And at the first stage, the first phase, we carried out research in 8 state universities in Indonesia to understand the processes of marketization in Indonesia on universities. And on the second phase, this is a scale up from the previous phase, and it is very much still in line with our concerns since 2014. So this has been a mid-term research program, so to speak, with more and more stakeholders since 2014. And first slide, please. We'd like to begin with the context of Indonesia. It's a huge country with a huge population of 267. It's the largest economy in Southeast Asia and the 3rd largest democracy in the world. And it's a Muslim majority country. Like other countries around the world, whether in the northern part or the southern part, increasingly our democracy is being colored by populism and polarization in our politics, identity politics. And one of the ways to mitigate this, we believe, is the use of evidence and sciences in informing public policy and public engagement. So we do think that sciences and evidence that are impartial, so to speak, or partial to the needs of those most oppressed in society is a task of social sciences and humanities scholars. And with that, Indonesia's stable economic growth, together with rising inequalities, have caused this rise in identity politics in our democracy. And this is even more so in the context of COVID-19, where there is still a gap between evidence and policymaking in terms of health, community resilience, medicine stockage, and public communication. which causes in some parts a rising panic and in other parts a lack of interest or apathy. If we go into the literature that we have, the foundation to seeing this is an existing political clientelism and corruption that still prevails until today, in spite of 20 years of reformation and democratization after our authoritarian regime. We still have a resource exhaustive centralized bureaucracy, and it also impinges on the kind of management in our universities, both in Zulfa's Semarang University and University of Indonesia. And legacies of the authoritarian regime is still within our bureaucracies, and it requires further reform, especially in the social sciences and humanities. Next slide, please.
Yeah,
we'll go to Zulfa from this slide on. Thank you.
Thank you, Naya. Am I clear?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Right, so we're going to highlight several key findings that we found out from our research, and just to open with, for your information, that we have found some positive as well as not so positive findings of the Indonesian social science research ecosystem. The first one that we are going to highlight is there has been an increase in funding, but then it was not followed by bureaucratic reform, necessary bureaucratic reform. As we can see from the diagram in the bottom corner, here Indonesia is in the corner. It spends 0.2% of its GDP on research funding, and this amount of research funding has been increased from 0.09 in 2013. But then this amount of funding is still, if we compare it with other countries, neighboring countries, it's still low, way below them. For example, Singapore spends 2.2% of its GDP, and then Malaysia spend 1.3%, and then Thailand 0.6%, and even Vietnam 0.4%. So we see here Indonesia spends the lowest as compared to the other neighboring countries. However, with this increase in funding, it was not necessarily followed with necessary bureaucratic reform to accelerate the research performance. And that's why it has shaped the institutional barriers, so it produced a low quality of research, a social science research ecosystem. The next one is that this kind of trend in the research funding, it has contributed to the nature of social science research. If we look at the demography again, out of those research funding, only 10 up to 14% are spent for the basic science. As we see here in the diagram, the trend is 10 up to 14% as compared to, for example, applied research, which receives the a dominant research funding, and then capacity building research. This kind of trend that is more attention on the instrumental research demonstrated by applied research has not enabled our social science researchers to have their scope of imagination, because the instrumentality of research doesn't really provide, if we compare it with innovation, it's not really, it doesn't really provide the foundation of innovation, because it's only basic research that provides this kind of foundation, because it provides that scope of imagination. So if there are claims for evidence-based policymaking in social science, as our survey may reveal, we have to treat them with caution. Why? Because first, there is little academic work in the social science to begin with. And then second of all, this kind of trend in the nature of social science research, despite them claim of being evidence-based, the tendency is that they are more cherry-picking data and findings to suit with the needs of policy making. So this means that policies are produced politically, but not necessarily academically informed, because evidence that is not produced through academically rigorous methods, among others from this basic research, not from applied research, they are vulnerable of cherry picking. We'll come back to these key findings again later, but then who are the main actors and what kind of responsibilities and roles do they play in the overall Indonesian social science research system? According to the DRA methods as we go, we categorize the research actors into four: higher education institutions, government and funding agencies, and then civil society organization, and private sectors. And higher education institutions, they remain, they dominate the social science research system. Statistically speaking, as we can see here in the table, they constitute the bulk of this. It comprises of 4,551 institutions, but then only 1,012 institutions are accredited with a variety of accreditations from A, B, C, and so on. And then in the spectrum of research functions, they are more into producing knowledge or producing research. So that's why, and it is proven from the publication. And then the second sector is the government funding agencies. Here, the relevant the relevant organizations are like Bappenas, or the National Development Planning Agency, and then LIPI, or the Indonesian Institute of Science, and so on. Their role is they fund research, and they also design research policies, which are highly bureaucratic and programmatic. And in the spectrum of research functions, they not only fund research, but they also uptake the research itself. And the third the third category is the civil society organization. They produce research, and the nature of their research is highly donor-driven and market-driven. But some of them are also government commissioned research, and as well as industry commissioned research. And this kind of research are used for advocacy and the basis of policy making. And they also play the role to disseminate research. The last one is the private sector. The nature of their research is usually for profit, through consulting services by providing research. Even if they provide philanthropic commission research, usually it's to build the institutional reputation. The factors that encourage or inhibit these kind of organizations, here we could classify it into this table. As you can see, the vertical axis here define the actors, whereas the horizontal axis show how those actors may have these encouraging signs, as well as the limitations that they face. The higher education institution being the one, the encouraging signs is that there is this increase in research funding, as I explained earlier. And there is also emerging networks of young researchers, like the Indonesian Academy of Young Scientists, or ALMI. But then these encouraging signs are inhibited by the slow bureaucratic reforms and the regional inequality, that most of these institutions are located in Java or in Jakarta, more specifically. And the second institutions is the government sector. the encouraging sign is that there is this new regulation launch that provides the legal framework to stimulate invention as well as innovation. But then the new regulation, it puts more emphasis on applied science rather than on basic science. And there is this very controversial clause that hinders academic freedom, especially the clause of penalty for the unregistered foreign academics who gather primary data in Indonesia without any permission. I think we can skip this time-wise. So basically the barriers that the Indonesian social science research ecosystem face is that these 5 barriers. The first is that there is this deregulation without the bureaucratization. As I have explained earlier, the efforts of Indonesian government to deregulate research institutions is not really accompanied with necessary bureaucratic apparatus to accelerate the process. So the second is that slow bureaucratic reform. And then third of all is audit culture, academic freedom, and monodisciplinarity, which I will explain one by one after this. The first is the audit culture. Audit culture is, as the name might suggest, it's a culture of financial auditing. So this kind of culture, it increases more administrative compliance rather than improving the academic performance and academic productivity itself. It includes rigid reporting, budgeting guidelines, and bureaucratic procedures. A very powerful comment made by our respondents in this issue is that this one in blue font, my colleagues and I are sometimes reluctant to do research because of the reporting process for audit. It has a very specific rigid format such as the balance sheet and so on. Revision, and it's really time consuming. This kind of comments really encapsulates the mundane activities as researchers that we experience every single day. So this kind of audit culture, although on the one hand it wants to improve accountability, but then on the other hand it is even counterproductive to the academic productivity of the social science researchers. And second of all is academic freedom. We know that academic freedom is central in enabling research actors to be able to push the boundaries of knowledge so they can offer us with alternative understandings of the social world we live in. And education institutions as well as social science researchers need this kind of freedom so that we could survive as well as thrive. But this kind of ideal condition is not possible under the current regulation and structure. And according to our in-depth interview with the social legal scholar in this field, Herr Lambang Wiratraman, the statistics is here. So out of 49 cases of the disbanding of academic discussion, the largest one is 37% of it concerned with the stigma of communism. This is the legacy of the authoritarian regime. And the 31% dealt with corporate pressure, 18% was related on religious topics, 10% is on LGBT, a very controversial issue across the world, and 4% are on other issues. So here, despite the collapse of the authoritarian regime, the New Order era, academic freedom is unfortunately still impinging our knowledge sector. And the last one is monodisciplinarity. Research problem is, social science research problem is never monodisciplinary, it's always interdisciplinary, but the way the universities are structured is always according to discipline. And in Indonesia, more specifically, we have this linearity concept in which we have to narrow our own educational experience to increase specialization. this might be good because we will have a very specialized a niche expertise, but then on the other hand, this has not enabled us to make kind of cross-faculty or even cross-discipline conversation and collaboration. So this has limited our interaction with peers from other expertise. And the lack of interdisciplinarity among research producing organization in Indonesia, it really hinders efforts to improve the performance of social science researchers. And what is the light at the end of this tunnel? Inaya will deliver that. Over to you.
So we've talked about the hindrances and some enabling factors, but the thing is, the leadership that we can find are still in the margins because they are not necessarily the product of good policy making, but historical accidents. They could be students going abroad and then returning as a lecturer, or it could be aspiring academics working from CSOs, etc. But such characteristics in the informants, among the informants that we interview, show that the mentoring that some of the young lecturers and lecturers receive after their PhD maintain their publication track in journals and monograph. And while they are promoted internally within the organization, this means they are promoted through, as Zulfa has said, state mechanism, state promotion. So usually they're insulated or insular. These mentoring processes make them able to compare themselves with their global peers, because as they publish themselves worldwide and they interact with their peers in the region, they see themselves as part of a network and not only as part of the one institution. So career development is really important to maintain that publication track, to align between the promotion mechanisms and the professionally driven academic publication that they are familiar with in regional universities and academia. And this requires continually building regional academic networks and interaction with extensive mobility that encourages lecturers to interact with their peers, whether interdisciplinarily or between countries. Next slide, please. And how do we do this? There are competitive grants existing within the Indonesian government, and also competitive grants that push for collaboration between institutions in another country with their Indonesian counterparts. And this is part of the government-to-government cooperation. And similar linkages or matchmaking between institutions in the form of grants can also encourage academic peers to collaborate with each other. So facilitating collaboration as a requirement to obtain the competitive grant, to work with people outside of their institutions, outside of their comfort zone, and outside of their discipline, outside of their gender, race. It could be any way, however the collaboration design is aspired by the policymakers. And this capacity building is linked with grants. So the capacity building is worked into the structure of the grant. So it's not so unsimilar to what GDN has been doing with us. We are also acquainted with our peers in Bolivia and Nigeria, etc. And this way, we're within the, among the multiple grant recipients, there can be a comparative analysis or an extension of that grant that trains them to think in a wider scope within the region. That way, the academic rigor can also go into the wider scope of policy analysis, not only within the domestic issues, whether it's provincial or central or Java or Indonesia, but also in a wider scope of increasing precarity with COVID-19, about non-traditional security in the movement of peoples, and all of the borders that can no longer be limited to only within the nationwide scope. Next slide, please. And the conclusions that we have arrived is the improved attempts and increase in research funding, while this has been done by the Indonesian government, are not paralleled with the bureaucratic reform within the universities, and this is impinged by the audit culture. So there's a transition between the transition from the centralized bureaucratic nature into the audit culture that is apparent in new public management and the neoliberalization of higher education institutions. So it's kind of like a holy matrimony between two very dense and compliant culture instead of academically promoting culture. We also see that there is regional inequality between the heavily industrialized cities in Java and some parts in Sumatra and Sulawesi, with the provincial areas in Java and also in the other islands. And this is related to also the local government's local budget to put into or disperse to their state universities or local universities. We also see gender inequality. There are less women occupying strategic positions. So while the percentage of women being lecturers are relatively even, but at the same time, the higher up the hierarchy, there are less women that are part of the strategic decision makers, which also causes professional biases in trying to manage domestic and public responsibilities. And this also affects academic quality. And the kinds of sciences that inform policymaking is one that is not gender aware. The recommendation that we have is a follow-up research on the implementation of the National System of Knowledge and Technology and how we can strategically place basic sciences not to supplant applied sciences, but to inform applied sciences so that it has an academic basis and less prone to being politicized during the elections. Next slide, please. And after discussing, next slide, please. After discussing the whole GDN report together, sorry, that was the end. Zulfa and I decided to extend the GDN, the DR report into looking into gender inequalities in the academia and what it means to have academic productivity among female academics in the social sciences and humanities, and how female laborers or female academic laborers manage the work-life balance, especially during COVID times. This can inform us about the mesh between caregiving, which is usually unpaid labor, with the kind of academic excellence that they may or may not achieve in universities. We would also like to find whether there's a gender gap in publishing, whether there's second or first authors, and the kind of power relations that is rebuilt that has marginalized women, perhaps female academics, and also those coming from marginalized identities, and prevent them from being part of the policymaking. We aspire to have more social inclusiveness and equity, whether it's based on gender or race or social class. So we hope that the DR report does not end here, and we continue to follow through with what we have argued about in the report. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks a lot to you, Inaya and Zulfa. A lot to discuss, a lot of invitations for discussion. So I'm just going to turn to our two commentators, two people we invited to share their take on the findings of the report. We have 8 minutes each to do that. So big challenge. First, I'd like to introduce Fred Carden, who of course wears many hats for those who know him. They're all equally appropriate to be for him to be commenting on this report. He was of course the advisor to this team as they were conducting the exercise. He's also a global advisor of the Doing Research program overall, and is the principal of Using Evidence, consultancy firm based in Ottawa in Canada. Fred, many thanks for being with us today so early for Ottawa time. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Francesco. It's great to be here, and it's good to see some old friends, both among the panelists and the participants, and also to see a lot of new faces. In 2014, the Royal Society in the UK published its Atlas on Islamic World Science and Innovation, and that included a country case study on Indonesia, which summarized the situation very well, noting that while Indonesia is not lacking in scientific ambition, decades of neglect have left its infrastructure too weak to build a robust R&D system. The situation hasn't changed, and that's confirmed in many ways in this report. I wanted to start by congratulating the team. The analysis on the situation of the social sciences in Indonesia is well done. Vast and complicated environment with, as they said, over 4,500 higher education institutions of varying types, varying locations, varying qualities. And I think it's hit all the high notes And the analysis gives the data and the evidence that's needed by those who want to try to change the situation. So you've captured the challenges really well. And perhaps because I've been connected with this study for its entire duration, and indeed was involved with by Nayan Masyanwar in some work in writing on the research to public policy space and the paucity of support in the academy, I wanted to focus more on what's next, because the report needs to be used, as Inaya said at the end of her remarks, it needs to be used to stimulate some discussion and debate about the future of the social sciences in Indonesia. The donor capture that you described in the report that leads to commissioned research largely outside the university fails to strengthen the social science research environment. So there's a need to think about the social science research community as a whole. You've alluded to that in your remarks and in the report, but to think about the universities, the policy research institutes, the CSOs that do research, private research groups and individuals, and how they can actually begin to work together to promote change. I wanted to highlight two issues in my comments. There are lots of more issues and elements to the debate, and you've raised a number of them, including the challenges to gender. But I would be interested in your reflections on these comments. And the first is that a number of levers of change are proposed in the report, but where are the entry points and how can they be activated, I think is a key question. Connectivity in the social science community is low, it's weak. But creating change needs some momentum behind it and a community that can lobby effectively for what it needs. So how can researchers from the universities, from the policy research institutes and the private sector come together and rally around some common challenges? Could a community of practice for the social sciences be built where the core issues raised in this report could be addressed? And could the donors be interested in supporting such a community of practice? Not too many of the donors are working actively with universities. They tend to work more with policy research institutes and CSOs. But if the National Academy of Sciences or the National Young Academy of Sciences were to take on the community of practice idea, could they find support for it? And would they be willing to engage with social science researchers of all stripes? And could the academies overcome their bias to the hard sciences, as reported in this study, to lead a social science research effort? And finally, could Science 45, the challenge agenda they prepared in 2015, serve as the rallying cry? Science 45, for those who don't know it, is a challenge agenda for the sciences for the year 2045, which is the 100th anniversary of the independence of Indonesia. It addresses a broad range of science challenges the country faces, and importantly, is bookended by the social sciences. The first section of this report is about challenges in identity and culture, and the final section is about community, economy, and governance. That report represents the best scientific thinking that the Academy could muster and could be used effectively to promote the social sciences and the need for more serious attention to them to achieve the national development goals. Is that a possible entry point? The second issue I wanted to address briefly is the question of internationalization and the barriers so well articulated in the report. And while I fully support internationalization, I think it's a hugely important element of scholarship, I also recognize the concerns the government and the national research agencies like KEYPLAYERS, as well as many researchers themselves, about the capture of research by foreign researchers in an extractive manner, and Zulfa spoke to that. There's a long history in many countries, including Indonesia, of well-funded researchers coming in, hiring the occasional local researcher because they speak the language or know the culture. And more than one national researcher has observed to me that they're not involved in the design of the research, and they often get no credit for the publications based on the research. The foreign researchers become known as Indonesianists or Africanists in other countries. So addressing this is an important challenge, and is not only about making it easier for international researchers, but making it easier for the ones who either bring a special skill that is sought or who genuinely want to collaborate with national researchers. One could consider some ways to address this that encourages internationalization, imagining, for example, several categories of international engagement, among them some international researchers who want to do their own research, and that's still a legitimate option. international researchers who are co-PIs on activities with Indonesian researchers, where both are actively engaged from the early stages right through to the publication. Researchers who bring a special skill set, there could be many more. And one could use different criteria with different categories and use the community of practice as part of the process of identification of appropriate research, as well as the research competitions themselves, as Inaya suggested. There would be some onus on the Indonesian researchers to speak up about abuse of the intent, but that's where a community of practice can be useful, because it's no longer an individual being censored for speaking up. It is about a community speaking up. On both of these points, I think the challenge is not to aim for wholesale change all at once, but to use the data in the DRA to pick up some issues, gather the collective energy of the social science community, and create some noise. At the 2015 launch of Science 45, I had the privilege to speak to the Young Academy, ALMI, and I closed my remarks by saying, push the Indonesian Science Academy to action, get the Academy into the President's office pushing for change, help it generate public interest and understanding. And yourselves as the Young Academy be regional ambassadors for science. Use your positions in the Young Academy to promote science as a central element of the knowledge economy that the country needs to avoid the middle income trap. Indonesia and you face many challenges, but the same social science report, the same Royal Society report that I quoted earlier maintains optimism and concludes that Indonesia's scientific system has a great many strengths, but also some fundamental weaknesses. The flaws are not fatal, however, and if addressed soon and with genuine commitment, the country could start to change its scientific fortunes. And you are the ones who can make that happen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fred, for very insightful comments. There are a few questions also for you on the chat box. Feel free to address specific ones directly. Let's move to our second commentator, who's Januar Nugroho. Please correct me in my pronunciation of your name, obviously. Januar is an advisor to the Center for Innovation Policy and Government, CIPG, a scholar in the STI systems area, and has occupied a number of key policy roles, including as Deputy Chief of Staff for Analysis and Oversight of Priority Programs at the Executive Office of the Indonesian Presidency a few years back. Thank you for accepting eagerly the invitation to speak on our webinar and for being with us today. The floor is yours. You also have 8 minutes. Thank you, Januar.
Thank you, Francisco. And just like Pak Fred, I would like to thank everyone for being here, and apologize that I do not prepare scripts or any text preparation just like other speakers. Instead, I just have my own notes, listening to you, and of course reading this report. Let me start with thanking all the researchers. I think you have done a really good job in capturing a part of the complexity of doing research in Indonesia. I have never, well, it's not really accurate. I have a quite limited experience in doing research in Indonesia. I spent most of my time being academic outside Indonesia. And when I returned to the country, I was endowed with the political office job. You know, I was a public policy until a few months ago. So I understand how it is quite challenging in undertaking research, especially when we talk about social science research in the context like Indonesia. I read the full report as well as the executive summary, and I believe that it is a must read for everyone interested in research in general. Because I think many Indonesianists try to explain about Indonesia, but very few Indonesian scholars trying to portray this using their perspective, I mean Indonesian perspective, and then speak and share within the international communities. And I think the the intention of this report is twofold at least. One, it is to inform everyone out there who are interested in understanding more about doing research in Indonesia in terms of how it is being organized, how it is being governed, what is the enablers, what are the enablers, what are the barriers. But also, as I look at the structure of this report, it is also aimed to inform the policy. Here, I believe everyone knows here, but let me remind all of us. We have a big dream, Indonesia 2045. Great Indonesia among the top 4 or top 5 of global economy. That kind of dream, Indonesia in 2045, for sure, that kind of economy is or should be knowledge-based economy. And in order to go there, in order to have knowledge-based economy, we need a knowledge ecosystem. This is my argument. I've been arguing this for many, many years back. This is why we need evidence-based research, because I think the way we govern the country, the way we run the government, I think it's a bit not quite there yet. And this is why this research is important, because I think this research lays a firm foundation why such ecosystem is needed. This research clearly points out what are absent from the ecosystem, what components need strengthening. And I think this is what I would like to thank the researchers for quite articulative in saying that. Although for other things, for example, critics for political system, for example, is not very much there. But I believe and I understand why it is put this way. Those are the general comment. On the particular, I think it is important whenever I read the research or whenever I read the research report, I always ask myself, what are things that now I know only after I read this report? Or what things that I already know, but now getting, confirmation after reading the reports, because otherwise I'm not interested in reading the report at all, or this report doesn't have any relevance for me to read. And I think quite a number of it, if I may point out, about gender and regional inequalities, which create disparities in risk activities. I think that needs, more emphasis. Capacity to communicate quality research to academia, not just and the public, but also to policymakers. That is important, needs more strengthening. And then things that I think for us, I mean for me, when I joined the government, when I was sitting in the office of the president, I know that the policy making is informed by research, but not always. And I think you put it here very, very strongly. Policymaking is predominantly informed by research with limited theoretical grounding that lacks a strong tradition of peer review. And I think this is the time, Inaya mentioned about the relevance of COVID-19 hitting Indonesia at the moment and all the countries. And I think to be fair, every countries across the world, they suffer the same thing. But what differentiates between the country or countries or governments who manage to tackle this is that whether they have the so-called state capacity, whether they have the capacity to make a policy, to implement in a timely manner so that they can save lives. And I think that's what makes the difference. And I think this is important that you point this out. To me, one thing that strikes me after reading this research, and I would encourage you, the researchers here, for the further agenda, is transforming this report into a policy brief, because it is very clear, and to me, the main message is that research is never a priority for the country. Let me repeat, research is never a priority in this country. We prioritize investment. we prioritize economic growth. But if we are going towards knowledge-based economy, if we are going to be a country, a nation, you know, whose innovations are there, whose economic capacity is being pushed forward by knowledge, research has to be national priority. And if you look from now, back 30 years ago, back 20 years ago, or after Reformasi, after the Reform 1998, I sit in the office of the president for 7 years. I served 2 presidents and 4 chief of staff. And I never see research as a priority. I think this is the main message that has to be there. We have done lots of things. Even with the Undang-Undang Sinas Iptek, National System for Science and Technology, I don't know, in the report this called National System for Knowledge and Technology, but I think it is more, I don't know, let's check, but to me it's more closer to a National System for Science and Technology. Although we have that law, but that law needs to be articulated, that law needs to be implemented. And the way it is articulated, the way it is to be put is to make sure that research should be priority. Then we have our battlefield. Then we have our area. So I think it is important, again, for the report. This is my final remark. Thank you for this interesting, beautiful, and substantive report. This report needs to be transformed or to be, you know, translated into one policy brief, 2 popular articles, so that many people can read this. Of course, academic outlets is always good for the collaborators. I mean, for the authors. But for me, if I remember my role back in the government, and if someone came to me or comes to me with this kind of report, I would like to see, okay, now what I need to do. Of course, you have to do advocacy. You have to advocate this. But with this very, very good material, now we get the momentum. I see COVID-19 as a momentum, as a wake-up call for all of us here, government, non-government, everyone in the university, how we need this knowledge ecosystem, how we need to really build our research capacity. So we have 2 big homeworks. One, research capacity. Second, the state capacity to be able to function well. If we want to have Indonesia 2045 as reality, not just a dream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanuar. Let me just switch my video back on, and I'll invite you to stay with your video on, and I'll invite also Fred, Zulfa, and Aya to switch the videos on as we move to discussion. Really, we have a wealth of questions coming from the participants on very many topics, but I'd like to first invite Inaya and Zulfa to address some of those that were raised by Fred and Yanuar. I think, you know, there's 2 main ones. One is like, what are the actual entry points? Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking a lot about how to move from the findings of our report into something that offers a pathway for change. So one idea was like what we call the levers of change. So where do we define levers of change based on actual evidence? You know, what are the best entry points? But, you know, Fred seems to suggest that actually that's still not enough. You know, we need to actually find entry points, very specific, concrete entry points, things that are already going on, things that exist that can be leveraged for change. Fred mentioned a few. There are a few more coming from the questions, including the idea of regional bodies like ASEAN playing a role in connecting researchers, at least at the regional level, to boost academic freedom and a culture of research. What do you think are the top 3 entry points that you see from where you stand as researchers to stir change in the system?
Zulfa, may We would argue that academic mentoring is one of the key entry points. And this can be achieved through, I've answered one of the questions, this could be achieved through joint funding from 2 or 3 or even regional governments that require academics from different countries to work with each other. And I think we have been prepped with COVID to actually cooperate and talk to each other and communicate better through webinars and through Zooms. So we could follow through the digital spaces that we've already, that we are increasingly shaping during these times to realize collaboration even during really difficult times or even when we don't have any resources. So each researcher can carry out the research in their country, and another researcher from another country would write together with them to analyze the data. That way there is some interdisciplinarity and collaboration. And such grants or such funding, while they require different countries to participate in one research, they could also require one of the research centers of research excellence in the region to mentor the co-principal investigators and train them to manage their research professionally, to make sure that their methodologies are not only rigorous, but are also socially inclusive, and to open up their horizon in terms of thinking outside of the box, because sometimes we are too much into our audit culture that we are running like a machine and not being able to see things outside of the ordinary. So we would argue that academic mentoring that is integrated into the joint research funding, because practice comes from resources, and resources are strengthened by the practices, is, I think, a process, a cyclical process, reiterative process that needs to be built upon. Maybe Zulfa would like to add to that.
Yeah, I think, and also in correlation with Rizky Amelia Zain here, because I think the question is also related here. Rizky Amelia Zain asks, what is the light at the end of this tunnel? Because it seems like everything is dark. So what I would say here is that maybe as researchers, we can start to work as researchers, as agents, because if we wait for a big change in the structure, it would take some time, because it involves so many things, so many calculations. So maybe as researchers, we could collaborate with like-minded people, build more and more networks, so small ripples, it will get bigger. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both. It's interesting because obviously, I mean, it's natural that you're thinking of entry points for you as individual researchers, right? I mean, what can an academic in the system, how can I work? Where can an academic in the system find kind of fresh air and good partners? Now, some of the questions point to, and also the findings of your report, I mean, the analysis you do point to a very high level of frustration with how institutions operate, and the question of research leadership within institutions. And you know, it's the audit culture that we talked a lot about, and this attention to numbers as opposed to quality, etc. So what do you think could be useful to stir some change at that level? So not at the level of individual researchers who might be actually interested in building a career, you know, of international quality within their own discipline, but for research administrators, what could push a research administrator to change the research culture within an institution, to change the incentive structure that the system is now kind of imposing on researchers? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Zulfa is a research administrator, so she would be better positioned to answer that question.
Zulfa.
No,
So all depends on you. Well, please.
Well, research administrator is somewhere in the middle. I mean, because my experience is very limited, because I'm in a middle, middle tier university, not top tier like INAIA, and it's really close to the central government. So it's politically more geographically closer. With my experience, maybe as a research administrator, we could, the way we build research teams, and from this I actually learned from Inaya the way we built our research team. So we put what is it, the right person in the right position, and also with research grant actually, but this is really difficult with the government because they have their own, well, every research, what is it, every research or funding organization, they have their own interests, and they have their very specific goals. But then the thing is, as researchers and research administrators, we also need to have our own values. So maybe these values that will intersect with other values, and how we negotiate that kind of values and principles and visions is something that will maybe create that space of change. Maybe, I don't know. Inaya will know more about this.
I'd like to add to that if possible.
Of course.
If we want research excellence, we should have management excellence. And because we're working in the academic and research environment, it means that our managers also need to be excellent managers, meaning that they perhaps would benefit from writing and being peer reviewed in their management research or their management practices. And there are existing journals that actually review research and management practices. That way there is a review process that holds the managers accountable in their profession. Likewise, I have my own academic research in identity politics, and I have this science activism that we're doing today. And that's a way to keep myself accountable for the kinds of criticism that I express and remain objective, even though we're smack in the middle of the problem.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. There's that question that got a lot of likes. Yeah, and it's a basic question. What do you mean with academic freedom? Right? Because there are no rules about that. So I think it's important what you both just said. It's not, you know, it's about, of course, individual researchers. It's about managers of research, administrators of research. In a way, people who have the power to allocate funding and people and regulate. But ultimately, what we're looking for is strengthening academic freedom. Yeah, this is very clear in the report. How do you define academic freedom? What does academic freedom look like, and why doesn't it come automatically, naturally to researchers in the system?
Zulfa, may I? We're part of different alliances for academic freedom, and we also have allied ourselves with journalists who have fought for press freedom in Indonesia. And like any, because we're social scientists, we see that legal definitions and rules and laws are product of social processes. And why freedom is important is because we require safe spaces to be able to hold accountable people who are in higher positions compared to those who are vulnerable to prosecution. So in journalism, in press, we see journalists working in resource-rich areas being persecuted, or those talking about race and religion are being prosecuted. And having such an alliance protects journalists from being individuals, as Fred says, being vulnerable individuals, and more as a member of a community. And in academic freedom, because for long in Indonesia and maybe in other parts of Southeast Asia, universities are shaped by the state, and some countries shaped by colonialist governments. And these institutions are designed to produce regulations or produce research and findings to support the state and the ruling state at that time. And this culture has not fully been unlearned by the people, and as well as the bureaucracy. So academic freedom is important to regulate, actually, to make legal so that no academic is penalized or criminalized for the kind of research they're carrying out, especially in research-rich areas, and those working with marginalized communities or with sexual victims, etc. There's usually a tension between religious conservatism and in such issues, in such aspects. And academic freedom is important to talk about because the more critical the research, it's actually the more important we need to talk about it. And we need to make sure that those people are not persecuted for talking about the things that we refuse to remember, especially in a democratic country.
Very clear. Thank you. Thank you very much, Inaya. And hopefully
Can I
that
add a little bit on that?
Yes, of course, Zulfa. Go.
Yeah. This is according to the literature. There is a book written by our respondent, Herlambang Wiratraman, about academic freedom. And he said that it is academic freedom. There isn't any conceptual discussion on this, I mean, in the policy, but then it is explicitly stated in our higher education regulation, and it is translated in some of the university statutes. But then never this word of academic freedom has been discussed openly and it becomes the reference to maintain and to protect the academic freedom itself. So it is located in this ambiguous space so that it's easily referred or used or twisted, misused, yeah, or whatever. Yeah.
Thanks. I think it's very clear and obviously critical to this discussion. There seem to be a few comments that try to basically test whether you're not maybe asking too much. Yeah. which is interesting. I think you just provided a great explanation there about academic freedom. You're not actually asking too much. But also a comment here that basically offers an entry point and says basically that frustration would be reduced if researchers, particularly in universities, can join the consortium of the National Research Priority for Social Sciences and Humanities. So that you have an invitation, an open invitation. Now, I'm not sure who the person is, but maybe you have an actually official invitation to this consortium to set research priorities. There was another question which might be important to discuss again when we critique the audit culture. Yeah, somebody, I think this question was already answered by you, Inaya, on the chat, but I think it would be good to answer it live. Somebody basically is asking, how do you balance accountability of research so basically the need for regulation of how research funding is used with, of course, academic freedom and the need to contain the bureaucratic burden on researchers. Let's address that, because I think it's a very important problem that relates both to national systems. We learned from your report that the requirements today basically shrink the research time to 3 months in a year, with the alignment of the funding cycle with the government budget, which is obviously a very small window to do a research. But I think it's also relevant for donors, because they often add on top of that their own conditions and bureaucratic requirements. Inaya, Zulfa?
Yeah, my answer to the question was accountability is very different in practice with compliance. Different donors, different government schemes, different private sector organizations apply different sets of financial requirements and regulations that need to be studied rigorously so that each organization is auditable. And this has shaped a culture of compliance. So we see financial managers not wanting to take the risk of not being auditable or to be found with a report that has exception, because that would decrease their key performance indicators. This is the kind of process that is apparent in new public management and also in state enterprises and other organizations as well, whether producing research or manufacturing goods. What we think is having financial accountability means that the principal investigator, this is a scheme that we've tried in Australia with a joint research with Australia. the principal investigator holds the responsibility of to spend the funding, and they would be in charge of procuring services, procuring researchers if needed, and the budget is reviewed by the financial manager. But the spending, the expenses are within the responsibility of the principal investigator. And such a person would have to be a professor, at least with decades of experience of being called by auditors, of being possibly criminalized, so that way he or she can protect the younger academics within the research team. Another way for this is to have a research center, an organization that carries out research management for the researchers. So that way different sets of financial regulations are managed by a unit that is dedicated to disperse the funding and carry out the administrative and financial load for the researchers, so that way they can focus on the research. So there are two ways to do it, individually or organizationally.
Thank you, Inaya. Very clear again. So I just, Jana, thank you for. I realized that the actual invitation to join the priority setting for the agency team came from a very authoritative place. So the Deputy for Social Science Research at KEYPLAYERS. So excellent. But this happened here on the webinar. Now, one last question I want to ask, or maybe let's see if we have time for more, but one important question, I think, going back to Yanuar's comments, basically his call for advocacy, right? For putting research on the agenda, on the policy agenda. Obviously, different actors in the system have their own agendas, and they're trying to obviously push their own agenda. Obviously, your first answer to what we can do is it relates to the mobility of individual researchers, to the importance of partnerships, intellectual partnerships, and collaboration in the region and beyond. Now, it seems to me obvious that putting the issue of research on the agenda will require some kind of alliance, some kind of coalition, yeah, between different actors. Who could be part of this coalition? So who are potential allies? Obviously, KEYPLAYERS is inviting you to join. So maybe you have a potential ally there within the system. Januar is obviously an ally, intellectually certainly. Julian obviously can be an external ally, right? But what are the groups? What are the people that you think need to be mobilized in order to achieve this objective? I think everybody, agrees is important, putting research on the agenda in the battlefield. From your perspective, maybe,
yeah.
Go.
Inaya first, maybe. Inaya, you want to say first? It's okay.
We would probably say the same thing. I would say our allies is reformist bureaucrats, because I have had conversations and they're as frustrated as academics actually. And also colleagues from CSOs working on topical issues, they are allies with researchers working on that issue. And in some instances or contexts, there is a sharing of resources from each organization and institution, because in social sciences, we are inevitably become immersed and very close to the community we work with. So these are usually in the margins because they need to bring in the resources from their own institutions and research, and it's not yet systemic. So the reformist bureaucrats and CSOs working in social issues is who I'd say an ally, together with journalists as well, because they also take interest in our social research, especially those coming from perhaps environmental desk or health desk or social humanities desk. And we've talked to each other over the years, and some of our respondents have said the same as well.
Okay, just to add a bit to what Inaya said, Francesco, now it's clear, I agree with her. Only a bit addition, not just frustrated bureaucrats, but also, I would term them champions. We need to be able to map and identify champions. with whom we can really ally within the government, because having research important in a discourse is quite different, and it is entirely different game when we try to advocate this, when we try to put this into a national priority, when we try to put this in motion with other national development programs. So I agree with what Inaya said, and I think what it now needs to be done, if I may push this a bit further, Francisco, is really to get this research out there. We need to communicate this report much wider, to much wider audience. I agree with what Jane said in the chat column. It is important because it offers critical analysis on what's holding back. But also, thank you, Inaya, you offer a range of possible solutions. And I think this is why it needs to be communicated much more widely. So I would suggest op-eds. I would suggest more, more popular webinars, not just for academics, maybe like us, but also for journalists. We need to have this appearing in the national newspaper. We need to have this communicated. Even I would suggest, I don't know, CIPG or GDN, or with support from KSI or anyone in Indonesia, to arrange meetings with I would say champions, with ministers who are our friends. Minister for Research, Minister for Bappenas, National Planning, Minister for Bureaucracy Reform. Do not forget that most of our universities are state universities, and most of the lectures like Inaya, Zulfa, they are governed under Ministry of Pan-RB, not just Ministry of Research and Education, the career progression, for example. So I think at least 3 ministers plus LIPI, of course, and thank you, Bu Nuke, to be part. I just realized that it was Bu Nuke who wrote the questions to, or 2 questions to Inaya and Zulfa. I believe she is now the highest official in this webinar. But I know, so we have LIPI, we have BPPT, we have Ministry of Research, Bappenas, and Pan-RB, to mention a few who can be our ally. And I believe they share similar ideas, if not the same ideas, with what we have here in this report.
Thank you. I think with Fred.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add one point. I think that we have to figure out who's the we who's going to influence the ministers and provide them with some ways forward, because that's where there's a real challenge. And that's where I think the researchers need to get together and really think seriously about what are the changes that they need to be pushing, whether it's at the procurement level, whatever the changes are, but there really needs to be a concerted push by the researchers to get stuff into the media, as Yanwar said, get stuff into the ministers and the frustrated bureaucrats who want to help, but they don't know how. And that's where I think the researchers have to go beyond the research to think about what's the application.
What do you plan, Francisco? Or what do you plan? I mean, GDN.
Inaya, Zulfa, how much time do you have in your life left for this? No, I know. I mean, there's always, no, we agree. I mean, I personally agree, of course. And actually, Inaya, Zulfa were quite good on this, because there was an op-ed published on The Conversation, on the website The Conversation, even before, months ago. And they did the same. There was a few articles in the newspaper for the previous study, etc. Of course, we should and we will do more. The report is being translated as well in Bahasa Indonesia, so that's obviously very good. But I think we should just sit and brainstorm about how what else we can do. How do we get people together to discuss? To discuss the next steps, how to bring this out in the public and target specific personas. I don't know if Inaya, Zulfa have last comments to respond to this very warm invitation to stir the country towards in a new direction.
A very heavy question. If I can speak honestly, I hope I'm not speaking ahead of myself. After the first GDN and the second GDN, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences has now decided to create a Southeast Asian Research Center. And it's in collaboration with Australia. And we've talked to the minister who's supportive. So the hope is for such research to engage a wider debate, a more long-standing debate, because there is actually an institution that practices the kind of advocacy that we've been trying to do for the past years. So one of the things that we'd like to achieve is that having an organization that protects researchers and not make them vulnerable to be individuals, but part of a larger community. And hopefully more such research centers will emerge.
Zulfa, any comment on this?
No, thank you. That's enough
no.
from Inaya. Yeah, I'm just typing my responses.
I want, yes, of course.
We're answering the questions while talking to you. Sorry, I can't seem to hear your...
Can you hear me now? Hello? Yes. So I was wondering whether the Young Academy of Scientists could be a very useful kind of vessel to bring this forward, the conversation forward. What we're saying is obviously it's not like Zulfa and I and CIPG who have to do all of this alone for everybody else. I mean, you need obviously a group, a conversation and a mobilization at different levels, right? So how to start this conversation. Perhaps the academy is it's an open question. I'm not suggesting it, but I'm curious to know if the Young Academy has the energy, being the Young Academy, to carry this forward. But I'm afraid we will have to leave that question unanswered, because we're coming to the very end of our webinar. So I'd like to thank all of you, of course, Inaya and Zulfa and Fred and Yanwar for joining us today, and all of you who have joined us on Zoom and asked questions and interacted with us, including those who haven't interacted with us, who just listened. I think we had around 70 people connected, which is nice. Of course, we take this conversation much broader. For now, this is just one step, right, in the process of disseminating the findings, and we hope it can be a kind of a launching pad more than anything else. You'll be able to find the full report on our website, so gdn.int. There's a link on the main page, on the homepage, to the results of the Doing Research program. You'll find the full report there in English. CIPG is working on the translation. We'll make this webinar available, and please do not hesitate to get in touch with us if you have any questions, want to go deeper in any of the aspects that we discussed today. And very last announcement, as I mentioned, this is a global program. We have more countries, more country reports coming. The next one will be Nigeria, and we'll be announcing the date of the next webinar very soon on our social media and on through our newsletter. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great day or a great night, depending on your time zone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.